Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Friday, June 20th, 2025, and today we're going to talk about a potting soil horror story, how to understand your farmland, which will make sense when we get there, and it's Feedback Friday. So let's do it. All right. Happy Friday, y'all. We've conquered yet another week. Pat yourselves on the back, just, gently. I had another calm day yesterday, but the plan is to make up some of the lost work over the next 2 days with my back feeling better. It also poured rain again yesterday, which limited what I could do anyway, putting us at nearly double our yearly average of rain by this point in the year, according to my Precip app. I sometimes think it's funny that I start out talking about weather so often because weather is the cliche small talk in almost any other context that isn't farming. But on this podcast, I feel like it would be weird for me not to talk about the weather. Anyway, it is Friday, which means Feedback Friday, where we explore what you all were saying about this week's topics. On Monday, we talked about lettuce and about my desire to have a collector for my mower. And I liked this from @JohnRosier, 1686, who wrote, quote, "We bought a pull-behind leaf rake to collect up the leaves in the fall, but it also worked well in the early spring to collect up the extra grass clippings instead of just having them pile up on the lawn. As for refrigerating lettuce, be careful not to set the temperature too close to freezing because it's not hard to get lettuce to freeze and then it's not very presentable. Thanks and keep up the good work with these videos /podcast," end quote. Indeed, both of these are good additions. For the lettuce point, this is a good note. We always even make sure it is any lettuce bags, if we're taking them to market in the cooler, are separated from the frozen water bottles that we use to cool down those coolers, because if it touches at all on those frozen water bottles, it will freeze the lettuce leaves and they will blacken. And like John said, it's not very presentable in that way. And I also liked this from @FireDogs, who wrote, quote, "My grass collector has been a back saver. We have been thinking of a mini baler for our walk behind, but I'm having a hard time justifying prices," end quote. I mean, truly, a grass collector can be a couple to a few $1,000s and come with its own headaches for sure. But those walk behind balers with a rake are like $10,000 to $12,000 for the entire setup, not including the tractor itself. If you spent even $500 a year on hay, it would take like 20 years to justify that baler, which, will it even be working in 20 years? I don't know. So yeah, cool, but maybe not for, businesses wanting to survive or just like regular people. On Tuesday, we talked about nutrient deficiencies versus diseases, and I thought this was helpful from @InBarS Microgreens. Quote, "A couple of thoughts about nutrient deficiencies. In addition to colors of leaf tips or veination, be aware of where deficiencies are occurring. Is it on new growth, old growth? Because you may be looking at old leaves that are getting shaded out, or plants often shed other leaves first, so you may see them yellow, but your growing tip growth is still rocking along. But some deficiencies can be seen in old growth first." Also about blossom end rot, it's related to nutrient availability. I've seen blossom end rot in soils chock full of calcium, pun intended, but because of things like pH and nutrient composition, the calcium is bound up and not plant available, end quote. Indeed, that is a good clarification about blossom end rot, and honestly, that goes for a lot of deficiencies. It isn't generally that the nutrient isn't present necessarily, it's that it isn't available for one reason or another, which often has to do with biology, but it can have to do with a lack of moisture or an excess of moisture or lots of other things. I also talked that day about the government's proposal in the new tax bill to sell land out west to housing developers, and there are many good comments about that in the thread. It should be said, we, the public, own a lot of land that is not being managed very well. That's a thing. That is like actually a thing. And it can be frustrating to the people who live in those areas for access and also for fire risks and all sorts of things. But selling it to housing developers isn't the solution either, which it seems like most people agree with that. These lands do need to be managed for sure. They need to be managed for fire control. They need to be managed for ecological abundance and protection. That could mean leases to farmers for grazing, or leases to agroforestry projects, or researchers or whatever. It could mean many different things, but what it can't mean is losing public lands permanently to real estate development. That just feels unacceptable. On Wednesday, we talked about flowers and also the loss of farmland to an increase in manufacturing. And I liked this from Patreon member Miriam Cantaloupe, which is a very fun name to say, Miriam, who wrote, quote, "Hi, Jesse. I was really interested in today's show. I help manage a very large urban community garden in D.C., And our board was just brainstorming ways to encourage our gardeners to encourage more diversity, especially flowering plants. So the episode was timely for me, and I appreciate your perspective as a larger scale grower. What I really came here to comment on, though, was the industrial parks. I read a very interesting article recently that others on here might have some takes on. Farmland, neighborhood, and green space turnover in Maryland and Virginia for data centers needed for increased AI demand is becoming a huge issue, end quote. And Miriam links an article that I will also link in the show notes about farmers in Virginia, where these data centers are looking to build a massive electrical cable through neighboring farms. I talked about manufacturing yesterday and its effect on farmland, but yeah, data centers, the cloud, digital coins, AI, all of that stuff is simultaneously wreaking untold amounts of ecological havoc, and not to mention devouring our farmland and stressing our electrical grids. This is not necessarily stuff that we have to have in our lives, and yet we're willing to sacrifice the things that we actually need in our lives, clean water, clean air, soil, forests, farmland, for it. It's a catastrophic bummer, and there is no political will to stop it. More frustratingly, I guess, it feels like the exact opposite of that. The political will is the winds that are blowing these things into our lives. I recognize that it's a daunting challenge culturally to address this upcoming disaster, but our apathy to do anything about it is going to be a hard surrender to explain to our future generations. So that's fun. Then on Thursday, we talked about the ants, and I liked the ants. I think they're probably just called ants. Anyway, we talked about ants, and I liked this question from @Jason Bronham, 1178, who wrote, quote, "Ants in the greenhouse, what about dusting with diatomaceous earth," end quote. And that's a good question. So diatomaceous earth, or DE, is the crushed fossilized shells of diatoms. And although it may be effective with the ants in the greenhouse, the DE has to stay dry, which under the trays in the greenhouse where our particular ant problems are, it's not super dry. So that would be a bit of a challenge. It is also a bit of a broad spectrum pesticide, meaning that it could be an issue in terms of bugs that you do want there. And of course, it's not great to breathe it in. You have to be super careful with using it. I'm not hyper against DE necessarily, and it may work for ants and drier situations. I would just be cautious using it inside and wear a mask, and also, don't use it around other insects that you actually do want. And thanks for all the comments on the back pain. I actually have had a pretty good run without a ton of back pain in the last 6 or 8 months, but I've gotten out of the habit of, because of time, lack of time really, of stretching properly and exercising properly to strengthen my core. So lesson learned there. As always, thank you all for the great conversations and comments. You all absolutely rock. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, a potting soil nightmare. Why not? BRB. Today's episode is brought to you by FarmRaise. Still struggling with your balance sheet? Your lender's asking for a balance sheet and you're stuck with a spreadsheet mess or guessing your numbers? FarmRaise Tracks takes the stress out of farm finance. With one click, you can generate an accurate, up-to-date balance sheet that shows your assets, liabilities, and equity. No accounting degree required. You'll be ready for loan applications, tax season, or just a clearer picture of where your farm stands. Join thousands of farmers using Tracks to build stronger businesses. Get 20% off with code NOTIL20 at farmraise.com for the lifetime of your membership. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Jesse Finch, who writes, quote, "Hey Jesse, I made the decision this season to use a new company's soil mix for my greenhouse seedlings, and it has proven to be a bad choice. Not only was it chock full of annual and perennial weed seeds, yikes, but once germinated, the growth rate is glacial. In my zone and context, I won't be planting outside for another few weeks, but I have to admit I'm in trouble. I'm hoping with some fish hydrolysate their growth rate will pick up, but I can't afford to purchase starts off farm. What would a response to a situation like this look like? Do you have a contingency plan in place when trying a new soil mix on your farm? Your thoughts and prayers are appreciated." End quote. Okay, so this is a great question, and I always tell Patreon members if they need an immediate response to please put an alarm bell emoji so I know to tackle it right away. And Jesse did this. So here was my original response as I wrote it, quote, "Dang, what a bummer to hear this story. So first, you have to reach out to that company. I may kill them with kindness, but also be very clear that this was not acceptable kind of person. If it were me running that company, I would want to know if my product was not up to par. So don't hesitate on that. If they are professionals, they will make it right. The weed seed in particular is just not okay for soil mix. As for trying a new soil mix, I would suggest starting small with a demo and grow those plants against another box store brand, or I'm adding right now, another brand that you trust. Also, talk with other growers in the area and see what they are using. I can address this more in the show later, but for now, I think that fish hydrolysate should help, end quote. And Jesse wrote back that and said that the company's response was, this is expected with living soil mixes, referring to the seeds and the slow growth, I guess, and that Jesse's seeds shouldn't have any trouble, which is a wild thing to tell a customer. Now, there are scenarios where a litigious grower could have a legal case against this company. So if I'm a company who is just starting out in the potting soil mix business, I'm going to be very cautious about these issues and handle them thoroughly, generously, and thoughtfully. Now, of course, maybe the mix was contaminated at some point in Jesse's possession, but that's relatively easy to prove as the company with a small sample and growing some seedlings out. Also, I wonder about the fertility issue. A good soil mix from a professional compost company should not have weed seeds, but also not fertility issues. These issues could be because poor compost is being used. It could be because there's little to no supplemental nutrients. It could also be because this is a new company using box store peat moss, which is not the same as commercial grade peat moss that professional mixes are made with. The box store stuff can cause anaerobic pockets. Whatever the reason, that company needs to make it right. Word of mouth is how these companies get their first sales often. So first impressions mean almost everything. This goes for any company. Build a small amount of screw-up loss into your startup budget and capital. Make it up to those first customers who take the chance on you, and they will appreciate that and tell their friends. That's customer service 101. On the customer side, definitely start small and have a backup plan. Like I told Jesse here, start with a small demo or side-by-side with something like soil mix just to make sure it's even going to work for you. Then, if there is a problem, let them know about it. Give them the details of your production, send them pictures, try to be helpful because it could be a good partnership down the line, but also just be clear of this wasn't adequate for us. So we'd appreciate either a new mix or a refund, whatever. That can be hard to do, but you also don't get what you don't ask for. Communication also gives them the opportunity to show you what kind of business they are or they're planning to run, and may save you time and money down the line knowing whether they are the type of folks that you do or don't want to deal with. In this case, they made a multi-level mistake here by not making it right. Jesse is not likely to support them again, nor will anyone who asks Jesse where they got their soil mix. So anyway, don't be that company, no matter what company you are. Growers especially, we like to talk and word spreads fast, so keep that in mind. All right, it's break time, and when we come back, how to listen to your farm. Be right back. Today's episode is brought to you by Farmhand. If you're listening to this, you probably found 5 rare minutes to breathe, but what got pushed back further down the to-do list to make that happen? If it's your CSA newsletter, you're not alone. Farmhand's new newsletter builder was made for busy farmers. It automates weekly emails, drives add-on sales, and makes it easy to keep your customers in the loop without spending hours behind a screen. It launches this summer, but our listeners can request early access now. Visit farmhand.partners/no-till. That's farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, back to the show. Okay, I came up with this the other day when there was a small group of beginning farmers here from the University of Kentucky, go Cats, and we were talking about different contexts. I think I was specifically talking about evaluating each bed in terms of compaction and how to prepare that bed for planting and how the preparation isn't always exactly the same every time, but the evaluation itself is. Sometimes I may or may not have to broad fork. Sometimes I may have to rake the bed to get it ready. And other times I can just dig a hole and shove a plant in there. It's the evaluation more so than the actual preparation that I've standardized. And because I haven't made a soccer analogy on here in a while, I don't think I have at least, let's fix that real quick. If you were to coach a team of players, you may come in with your own ideas of how you want them to play, the formation, the style of play, all that stuff. But the reality is that if you do not evaluate each player's skill sets first, all you may be doing is setting the team up for failure if they don't fit that specific system. In other words, it's hard to force a tactical philosophy onto a team. The team makeup must determine the tactics. This same idea applies to soil. So we all have these ideas about using certain levels of tillage or no tillage, compost mulches or cover crops, whatever. Broad forking or never disturbing. But if your soil needs something in particular that you are not giving it, the crop will fail. I have discussed how to evaluate your soil before, probably, but let's just take the example I was discussing that day as an example of what this looks like. I had mowed a cover crop back in April, and it had been covered since that time with a tarp. The cover crop residue was all but broken down when I pulled it back to show them to it, presumably from the consistent warmth and moisture we've had. So there's very little in the way of a mulch. How then am I going to proceed? Well, first, I'm going to go through and check the compaction. If I have to broad fork, I may go ahead and do that. Rake the bed and then plant whatever I'm going to plant. Or I will check and see if there are weeds coming through, like spindly little grasses that are still vaguely alive. And if so, I may lightly cultivate the surface, rake, and then plant. What crop is going in will have some say in how I do this. Like I may not need to rake if I'm planting tomatoes, but I will likely want to add some compost at the base of every planting hole just to ensure they have the adequate amount of fertility to get started. Though, of course, not too much because tomatoes can be easily over-fertilized. Just a nice little handful in each hole. Or if it's lettuce, I may cultivate the surface and rake it clean to ensure no weeds, but also an easy planting surface. If it's carrots, I may need to get the entire bed or beds ready, amended, then broad forked, then raked clean, and then not plant it at all, but rather add the tarp back over top to germinate any residual weed seeds. Then maybe if I sow a few days later, flame weed a few days after that, and then have the carrots grow up into a nice clean bed. Or perhaps I just add a light compost mulch if I have the material and trust that it doesn't have much in the way of weed seeds. I'll add that over top of the bed, then I go ahead and sow those carrots. In other words, I evaluate first and then act second based on the bed's conditions and the crop growing in. For me, it's not as helpful to force ideals on the land. I need the land to tell me what is ideal. In fact, in that way, especially when you're starting on a new property, it's important to have a system for evaluating the land and conditions, almost more so than it is to have a system for farming that land that you want to use going in, because the two may not jive. I say this often, but the farm we used to grow on had amazing soil. It was a little rocky and it was a little windy up there, but the soil was really nice. It drained really well. The stuff grew faster and the amount of sunlight it got was amazing. This new farm, however, drains poorly. The stuff grows slower. The soil is really thick. It's really, really compacted in spots. It is less exposed to the wind, however, which makes certain things easier. Those two farms are not like hours apart or in different parts of the state or in different states. I could be at that other farm in roughly 15 minutes from right now. That is how contextual everything is, and I cannot farm the two places exactly the same. Now, once you know what your land needs and what your general context is, you can systematize your evaluation and then systematize the preparation process, creating standard operating procedures for each crop or whatever, so that you know if X is true, then you do Y. But for me, it starts with evaluating the bed and letting that determine how to proceed. So anyway, lots of good soccer for you to watch this weekend. If you need any additional farming advice, I would recommend starting with racing tonight. Yeah, why not? Otherwise, I'm going to call it a week. Don't forget, No-Till Growers is now officially a 501c3 nonprofit, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. You can learn more about how to do that in the show notes. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you are getting this podcast. That's an easy way to help us out. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. And if you'd ever like to sponsor the show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and the team at No-Till Growers for their support. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. I can't hear it, but you can. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of June, you get a shout on the show. So big shout outs today to Rachel Kirk, Tim NG, Colton, Kyle Richardville, Patrick Weaver, Alex and Oliver, Bill King, and Chris Yates. All right, so this is the group the crew that is expected to help get John back to the diner safely with a truck full of produce from the farm that he was visiting in theoretically the past. And the truck itself deserves a little bit of a description. It actually is made with drones. It can actually fly a little bit. It can go over top of cars, around cars. They do have some minor brush-ins with cars that seem like they're following them, but for the most part, they're able to use some cloaking devices and all this stuff to get. It's very fancy stuff. But anyway, they managed to get to the diner. And they pull up into the back and they start to unload the produce. And the gruff owner of the diner comes out to kind of supervise and keep an eye out and make sure no one notices them. John, holding a small box of tomatoes, helping to unload them, is curious and asks the owner, "So those birds I saw when I was there, were those real? Like birds were real?" And the owner laughs and smiles and says, "They used to be, kid. They used to be." All right, everyone, thank you for watching and or listening. I hope you all have a great weekend. We will see you on Monday. Nothing else to say about that, I don't think. All right, bye.